Kapow, kaboom, kablam. Welcome. We're back for another week of Live with Littlewood with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Affairs. And it's been another pretty amazing week. We've got an action-packed 1 hour show for you tonight. Later on, we'll be joined by Tom Whipple, the science editor at The Times, and my first cousin, Ella Whelan, journalist, commentator, and author of What Women Want. Konstantin Kisin, YouTube star, political journalist and co-host of Triggernometry, fantastic YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed to Triggernometry, please do. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the IEA London YouTube channel, please do. We're just on the cusp of 10,000 subscriptions. So if you're not a subscriber yet, hit subscribe and the notification bell. We're going to be discussing the incredible news that thanks to the successful vaccine rollout, on Sunday and Monday, we dropped below 100 COVID deaths per day for the first time since way back in October. And although we've seen a slight rebound yesterday, we seem on track for getting the virus under control faster than planned. What does this trend mean for lockdown plans? Does the modelling that we were presented with a few weeks ago actually reflect reality? And if not, what should be changing? And at the end of the show, we'll be looking at International Women's Day. What is it? Should it matter? Does it matter? What do we need to achieve to bring about the year it actually becomes irrelevant? But before all that, we're going to be talking about risk-taking in a slightly different category. I'm delighted to be joined by Philip Davies, the Conservative Member of Parliament for Shipley. Good evening to you, Philip. How are you keeping?
I'm all right. Good to join you, Mark.
And our very own Christopher Snowdon, Head of Lifestyle Economics here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Good evening to you, Chris.
Good evening.
So we're going to start looking at, as I say, we're going to be discussing a lot about risk-taking when it comes to the vaccine rollout and lockdown, but we're going to look at this in a rather narrower way initially. We're going to be looking at policies relating to one of my favourite pastimes, gambling. You can still get 16-1 on Southampton beating Man City this evening, by the way. It's just kicked off. And I think after 4 minutes, Southampton is still clinging on at 0-0. So you can get a good stake back if you think we're going to nick that. The government's recently launched a review into gambling laws, and to quote from it, they want to make sure it is fit for the digital age. Gambling legislation is fit for the digital age. But a new report just hot off the press from Chris Snowdon considers whether this new review or additional regulations are necessary. This is a new paper, A Safer Bet. Chris has been doing some interviews on it today, and you'll be able to read about it in some of your newspapers tomorrow. Chris, what's your proposition and your analysis about the way we're regulating gambling?
There probably is something the government could usefully do, but it's not what the anti-gambling groups are calling for. I'm not convinced that this review is necessary. I mean, the government is saying that it wants to make sure gambling is good for the digital age. The last Gambling Act was in 2005.
Chris, we've got a problem with your audio. I don't know whether you can you just try again on your microphone?
Yeah, what's wrong? Is it too loud or too quiet? Or?
Very, very muffled. Very muffled. So we'll get our tech people onto that. Don't know what's gone wrong there. Philip, let me come to you. Sorry for that earache. I mean, there seems to be virtually nothing that this Conservative government, no area of human activity that this Conservative government doesn't want to regulate harder, deeper and more strictly. Isn't that the case with gambling as well?
Well, it looks ominously like it. I despair at the fact that the Conservative Party doesn't seem to believe in individual freedom and individual responsibility anymore, the things that I was brought up to believe as a devotee of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. So yes, it would appear that the government wants to try and regulate every aspect of everybody's lives in a way that I don't think is conducive to what I consider to be a conservative. I mean, with regards to the gambling review, I mean, look, I think that there's certainly more that the betting industry can do to look after its customers better, to protect its customers better. I think it can use the technology that it has at its disposal to do that an awful lot better, and that's something that Chris has put in his report, with which I concur. But what we shouldn't be going down the route of is basically having the state telling people what they can and can't spend the money on, because that to me is unacceptable. And at the end of the day, you can't take individual freedom and individual responsibility out of this particular equation in a way that some people would want to. And let's be honest about it, the agenda that some people have is that they're anti-gambling. They just don't like people gambling. And I'd have a bit more respect for their position if they were just honest about that and said, look, we don't believe in gambling and we don't think it's in anybody's best interest to gamble. It's a perfectly legitimate position to hold. It's just not one that I agree with. But this sort of salami slicing away, trying to pretend that it's all about protecting people when it's actually just an anti-gambling agenda is not something that I think is sensible.
And I've never really understood this. I mean, I think actually under most of the definitions, I am a problem gambler, but I mean, that doesn't actually trouble me particularly. I can comfortably afford my normal losses. I can comfortably afford the 10 quid I'm going to lose on Southampton tonight. But I've never really understood, where does gambling sort of stop and other areas of activity that involve risk begin? In effect, my home insurance policy every year is me placing a bet that my house is going to burn down. I mean, I hope that it doesn't, but it's a gamble, isn't it? I mean, if I knew it wasn't going to burn down, I wouldn't pay 300 quid a year on contents insurance. Yeah, it seems to be, if you like, the fun end of the industry that the Puritans are after, isn't it?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, home insurance is a prime example of gambling, because the insurance company will give you odds on something terrible happening to your home, and in effect you're placing a £300 or £400 bet a year that something terrible is going to happen to your home at the odds that the insurance companies are prepared to offer. But yeah, that's fine, because the people who are against gambling, they do that themselves. We've got this modern trend in politics, basically, which I hate, which basically means that as far as politicians are concerned, if they approve of something, they want it to be compulsory. And if they disapprove of something, they want it to be banned. There's no longer any sort of let's live and let live kind of attitude amongst politicians anymore. Everything's either got to be compulsory or banned altogether. Yeah, and I really despair. And I don't think it was my job when I got elected to Parliament to basically ban everybody from doing everything that I just don't happen to like myself. But it seems that for some politicians, they think their job's nothing else but doing that.
Chris, I think let's see if we've got you back and whether that blizzard that was blowing through your office or dungeon or whatever you're broadcasting from has abated. The argument here, isn't it, for stronger regulation is to deal with problem gambling there. I can't remember what it is. It's about 0.7% of the population. Nobody claims that it's anything like a majority, but nevertheless, for some people who pick up a habit or addiction, it can be incredibly destructive. And isn't that the justification the government's using for stricter measures, lowering limits? What's your analysis? And tell us, what are they actually proposing that you and Philip find so objectionable?
Firstly, am I coming through clear? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's better. The blizzard has disappeared. Yeah.
And Mike was working fine 1 minute before the show started. It was sod's law. What's been proposed? Well, the government itself isn't proposing anything. Government just says it wants to make this regulation fit for the digital age. Well, the last legislation was in 2005, which is, I would consider, the digital age. Not much has really changed actually since then. People were using the internet to gamble back then. The only real change has been the use of smartphones. I don't think that really is justification for completely new legislation. What's been proposed by the anti-gambling groups? Well, I think the most extreme policy is a cap, a monthly cap on how much you can deposit. And it's been suggested by one of the think tanks that £100 a month would suffice. And this is based on looking at the disposable income of the poorest people in the country. And you would be allowed to spend more than that, but you'd have to jump through a lot of hoops. You'd be effectively treated as if you were dealing in the proceeds of crime or taking out a mortgage. It'd be much more difficult to... Are you
serious? 100 quid a month?
I know, that would be nowhere near enough for you, Mark. I know, yeah.
I've often put 100 quid on a single match.
Well, quite, So I say these are extreme measures. Other stuff really involves making gambling less appealing, making online gambling less appealing, slowing down the games. for example, online, so they take the same amount of time as they would do in a casino. Well, in a casino, you've got to gather the chips and pay people out. They're slower for a reason. We don't make them deliberately tedious to put people off playing them, which is what is being discussed here. Similarly, lowering the stakes. So if you wanted to have a spin of roulette or a game of blackjack, you couldn't stake more than £2. This is directly copied from the war on fixed odds betting terminals. Of course, in casinos, you have to stake at least £5 or £10. So the anti-gambling people are kind of picking and choosing the least attractive bits of each of the kind of bricks and mortar sector and trying to apply them to online. And they're also wanting to ban advertising and sponsorship, which would be particularly devastating for snooker, which I have a particular fondness for, because nearly all the tournaments are sponsored by gambling companies, and there's no reason to think that a whole bunch of more wholesome companies are going to jump in and fill the void if gambling sponsorships banned. So none of this actually has any evidence that it will have any effect on problem gambling. They're all very blunt tools, and there's no reason either to think that that will be the end of it, even if the government capitulates on that series of policy demands.
Philip, do you think that the sort of online nature of gambling does risk it becoming a runaway train? I mean, broadly speaking, if you're in a responsible casino or a bookmaker's, you've got sort of staff there who can keep an eye on you, and, if they think you're acting irresponsibly, potentially intervene, refuse to issue more chips or whatever. If you're gambling on football on your iPhone, nobody is keeping a check at all, are they? So you could just sort of suddenly wash through, and it sort of doesn't feel to me when I'm gambling on my iPhone like real money. There's a friend of mine who insists he'll never do it on his iPhone. He has to go into a bookmaker's and hand over a tenner, otherwise it doesn't feel like real money. Do you think there is a danger with technology that you could just get this runaway chain? You can suddenly, place bets all over the place at a click of a button. There's a million different things on every match of football or horse race you can bet on. Isn't the government and even some of the Puritans right to worry about that?
Well, there's a theoretical risk, but actually the bookmakers they've become a lot better in recent years, actually, and and it's not necessarily unlinked to the pressure that they've been put under, but when you bet online, the bookmakers are monitoring your betting. It's not as if you're just doing it as a free-for-all. And I think they'd be able to tell you, I couldn't tell you, but they'd be able to tell you how many interventions they make with customers on a weekly basis, basically saying, look, we've noticed your play. You seem to be chasing your losses. You seem to be increasing your stakes rapidly. Do you need some time out? So they do monitor people's play, and they do intervene where they think that people are in danger of harm. And actually monitoring people's play online is in fact probably easier than not monitoring it online, to be perfectly honest. It's a lot easier. It leaves a trail behind it. If you go into a betting shop, you might go into 4 or 5 different betting shops, and that one betting shop will only know what you've been doing there. It's not, and there's nothing documented. It's all on people's recollection. So actually online in that regard can be potentially be safer if it's done properly. And of course the problem is, actually, we've got very low levels of problem gambling in the UK compared to many other countries around the world. And when I was on the DCMS Select Committee and we did an inquiry into gambling and we went to different countries around the world, they looked to us as actually the best example in the world where we'd actually legitimized gambling, we'd regulated it properly, we had low levels of problem gambling, but very high levels of people betting with legal firms. And actually, if you look around the world, what the problem that you can find is that in many countries there are very, very high levels of people betting illegally on illegal sites. We're very, very low in this country for people betting on illegal sites. And of course, if you make it really difficult for people to gamble, you'd make them jump through all these hoops, sending their pay slips, bank statements. Look, people aren't going to do it. And the danger is, of course, is that those people then move to illegal sites where they don't actually monitor your play. They don't intervene if you're losing lots of money. And actually the danger is you don't get paid out at all if you do win. So I think, we've got to be aware that you go too far down this route and you will cause a far, far bigger problem for people who might have a gambling problem.
Very interesting. And yeah, you're right. If you get into the black market, you're not dealing with Ladbrokes and Betfair. You're potentially dealing with the local mafia, right? Chris, is there any evidence to suggest, broadly speaking, at least until recently, the UK's had pretty liberal gambling laws. When American friends of mine come over, they're absolutely staggered that there's a sort of, a Ladbrokes or whatever on a street corner and you can walk into a casino and the rest of it. usually approve of it, I should say, but they're usually staggered about it, how liberal it is. And in the USA, it's extremely difficult to place a sports bet, right? Is there any suggestion there? Is there any evidence, Chris, that the more liberal you are on gambling, the more problem gamblers you get? Or is there no correlation? Or is there actually an inverse correlation, as Philip says, that it's just these people get forced underground elsewhere?
Well, what you can say is that in a number of particularly Asian countries where they do have very strict regulations, such as China, where there's an almost total ban, apart from some state monopoly lotteries, there is a very high level of problem gambling. That, however, may be more of a cultural thing. Some of these societies have a big belief in luck, and therefore people tend to gamble more anyway. I think what you can say is there's certainly no positive correlation. We should say that bringing in more restrictions does not seem to have any real effect on the number of problem gamblers. And you can sort of see that in Britain over the last 20 years. We started measuring problem gambling in 1999. It was about 0.6%. It's stayed almost exactly that figure, very slight fluctuations in the 20 years since. And you think about what's happened in those 20 years. We've had the Gambling Act, we've had legalization of gambling advertising, we've had the rise of online gambling, we've had the rise and fall of fixed odds betting terminals. None of this has made any difference whatsoever to the number of people gambling or the number of problem gamblers. So we haven't got a problem gambling epidemic, whatever you may read about in the paper. What we have, like every other country, is a low endemic level of problem gambling. And problem gambling can be very destructive. Most people kind of grow out of it, if you like. It tends to be men in their 20s predominantly. And there are things we can do to help. I think it's a good thing that the NHS has got these problem gambling clinics now and is going to create some more in the next few years. But that's how you deal with this, like you deal with any mental health disorder. You've got to work with people face to face. It's a very small minority of people, fortunately. Don't try and clobber the majority with these very blunt instruments that are just designed to make gambling less appealing, and ultimately will, in extremis, have the effect that Philip talks about of driving people to the unlicensed operators.
Sure, I think we've got a graph we can show on the screen on YouTube. I mean, adult gambling is a pretty common activity, right? I mean, lots of people gamble. We've got a graph showing adult gambling prevalence in the in the past month or so. It's a pretty common thing. But Chris, are you confident? I was interested in what Philip said, that tech might be the solution here. That, you know, back in the day, you might have in the local area, the bookmakers are keeping a bit of an eye on Jimmy because he seems to be gambling too much. But now, if you're doing it through the Betfair, Betfair Exchange or some such like, they have an exact record, and they can start to pick up quite nuanced things. Are you gambling late at night when you might have had too many to drink? Are you suddenly putting, twice your stake down if your previous stake's lost? So do you think tech could be the way about of kind of identifying this 0.5%, 1% of people who've got the problem and really getting assistance to them, which has been very much harder in a bricks and mortar environment, Chris?
Yeah, I do. I mean, there are advantages to being bricks and mortar. Someone can physically keep an eye on you. But the real eye-opener for me when I was doing the research for this report was just seeing how sophisticated the technology is in terms of monitoring patterns of play and then raising red flags and then intervening. There are about 20 or 30 different markers of harm you can look for. Playing late at night, changing the type of games you're playing, changing your deposits, changing the stakes you're playing at. All of this stuff can be looked at through sophisticated algorithms and spot people who are on the brink of becoming problem gamblers or are problem gamblers. Response from the company can be anything from a text message saying, did you know about deposit limits? Do you know about self-exclusion? All the way up to having your account suspended, sometimes permanently. And the companies do this. Now, I guess the objection from anti-gambling people would be that the companies don't have an incentive financially to do this, and so maybe they won't. Well, perhaps that's true. Actually, they do it a great deal as it is, and there is a reputational risk in not doing it. And I think perhaps this is where the government could look at legislation. Let's have a look at best practice. Let's have a look at all this excellent technology, see what could be used across the board, so we're not getting different companies using it in different ways, and standardize best practice in regulation. Let's kind of codify and consolidate all the various bits of guidance and voluntary initiatives that the trade bodies do and the guidance from the Gambling Commission. Bring this together as regulation and everyone plays by the same rules.
Philip, you've obviously got a professional background in the industry as well as taking an interest in it as a politician. Do you think this is the problem, though, that people will be sceptical that the industry doesn't have a financial incentive to solve the problem? You know, potentially me placing lots of losing bets is absolutely great news for Ladbrokes. It's a bit like the alcohol industry, you know, want to sell you as much whiskey as possible. How can the industry do anything to persuade people that they're on top of this rather than just counting the sums of money coming in, even from the small percentage who have got some pathological problem with gambling?
Yeah, I think there is an issue with people's perception of the industry that the industry certainly needs to sort out. In fact, actually, you know, you see this. Nobody really talks about scratch cards and the national lottery or anything like that. The anti-gambling campaigners very seldom go on about that, and that's largely because, you know, really they're not really that interested in who's losing the money. They're more interested that they don't like who's winning the money. And the money on the national lottery goes to good causes, so that's fine. But the money lost on horse racing and stuff goes to these nasty bookmakers, so we'll try and cut that out. You know, there is an element of that. I think you know, the betting industry has been slow off the mark, to be perfectly honest, at putting its house in order, and I've been conveying that message to them privately for many years now, that they needed to be much better. But I think they are now. They are, you know, for whatever reason, you know, people can speculate what the motive is, but they are now a lot better at this. They are really hot on this particular issue. They can always do more, and I would always push them to do more. But what we don't need is ham-fisted regulation. You know, this thing about £100 deposit, I mean, it's completely nonsensical. First of all, you know, it doesn't have any link to people's affordability because, of course, you know, a Premier League footballer with £100 limits each month on what they can deposit is ludicrous. Some people might not be able to afford £100 a month anyway. So, you know, we need to be tasking the bookmakers to be much more smart about how they check whether their customers can afford what they're losing. What we don't need, and if we incentivize them to do that and get them to do that and use the technology to do that, they will do it a damn sight better than a blunt instrument of the state coming down and basically damaging the industry in a way that will not actually help anybody.
Okay, well, I want to keep on the theme of risk as we open up to a kind of wider question. I guess my burning question is, Southampton are already 1-0 down. Should I chase my losses? They're now 33-1 to turn it round. No, I think I'll let that one go. I think I'll soak that one up. But I want to talk about risk in a different context as well. And we're going to be joined by Tom Whipple, my cousin and science editor of The Times. I guess we shouldn't be surprised that a government that doesn't trust people to manage the risk of going to the bookies might be overly cautious in other areas as well, not least the easing of our seemingly interminable lockdown. So on Tuesday morning, Professor Chris Whitty stated that all the modelling suggests there will be another enormous surge of deaths this year and a further 30,000 lives will be lost. But as of last week, the UK appears to actually be running approximately 3 weeks ahead of where the modelling suggested, and that modelling is just less than a month old. We seem to be beating that on the optimistic end of the scale. And as these tweets, which we're going to show on the YouTube side from Tom Newton-Dunn show, you should be seeing, which you should be seeing now on YouTube, we're also progressing faster than expected on the vaccine rollout. Tom, welcome to you again. Welcome back to the show. What's the basis of this 30,000 additional deaths figure? This is staggering, isn't it? Given all the over 60s have been vaccinated, they constitute 92% of deaths, and we're moving right the way through the over 50s now, who account for the majority of the remaining 8% of deaths. I mean, there's reasons to be cheerful now, aren't there, Tom?
There are plenty of reasons to be cheerful. I mean, I'm not a politician. I suspect there's an element of politics in this, in that Boris has been quite overly cheerful throughout this pandemic on several occasions. And now I think it's possibly seen with the vaccines that a bit of under-promising and a bit of over-delivering goes down a lot better. And that seems to be what we're doing. And that's great news. There are always going to be gaps in the vaccination program. The vaccines aren't perfect. It's become this sort of slightly strange Panglossian dogma now, where you have to say, you know, with every new variant that seems to allow reinfection, you say, oh, but they provide 100% protection against death and hospitalization. But they don't. They're very, very good at that, but it's not perfect. The concern is an absolutely massive wave. I think probably later on in the year, once quite a bit more has been released, and with that, a small proportion of a very big number can still be a big number. I have to say, I agree with Chris, who's been looking at this, that the modelling is already pessimistic. Its assumptions in particular about vaccine take-up and some of the efficacy assumptions are slightly underestimating things. And I think it's going to be a lot better than that.
Well, that's pretty encouraging then, right? But Philip, let me come back to you as the politician here. Is that what the government's doing? Under-promising and over-delivering? I mean, the Prime Minister said the other day that he thinks people want certainty, as if you're a pub landlord, you want to be certain that you can open on this date, rather than it being brought forward and it being uncertain. I mean, I get, Philip, that the government don't want to go through opening up and then having to shutter everything down again, but don't you think the level of caution here is almost craven, that we aren't going to open everything up until June the 21st? I mean, surely we've got to be open-minded that we could open things up before then, shouldn't we?
Absolutely. No, the government's timetable is way too slow. And actually, it's as if it doesn't have faith in the vaccination process itself. I mean, on the one hand, we're told that the vaccination process is, the vaccine actually works better than we could have expected. It's actually reducing transmissions more than we could have expected. More people have got the vaccine than we could have expected at this point. And yet we're still going at this snail's pace to ease the lockdown, which makes no sense. I mean, if you want people to have faith in the vaccination, then you've got to have faith in it yourself and say, well, because so many people and the most at-risk people have now been vaccinated, we can afford to ease the lockdowns. But it's absolutely ludicrous to my mind that, about a third of the adult population have had the vaccine at the moment. Virtually all the people who are going to suffer particular serious illness and death from it, and yet we're still weeks/months away from having the country reopened. It makes no sense economically. It's an assault on our individual freedoms, to be perfectly honest, that the government have just confiscated from us in an arbitrary manner. And it makes no sense from a medical point of view. I mean, it doesn't matter how many cases there are of COVID if nobody's going to suffer, or very few people are going to suffer serious illness and death from it. Why does it matter anymore how many cases there are when people have been vaccinated against the worst aspects of it?
Chris, what's your take on this? You've been, pilloried by some hardcore libertarians for even countenancing certain elements of lockdown. Do you agree with Tom's diagnosis? Is the modelling just wrong? You recently tweeted a graph highlighting that, according to the University of Warwick, July's deaths and hospitalisations will be worse than January's. I mean, I'm no scientist, but that sounds extraordinary to believe. What's going on here? Have we got any data? I mean, we've got some dates, but have we got any meaningful data or not?
Well, there are a number of models, including that one from Warwick. They all basically say there's going to be a massive spike in deaths in July and August, which, as you say, most people find quite hard to credit, given there were only about 10 deaths a day last August with fairly minimal restrictions. The frustrating thing about the models is, although it does give you a certain number of assumptions, which, as Tom says, is, most of them that can be tested have been proven to be too pessimistic anyway. But when it comes to actually really working out how they get to their figures, there's always a bit of missing information. You don't really know what they're assuming about the rate of infection, the R number. They do look very pessimistic. This 30,000 today actually is by far the most optimistic figure any of these people have come up with. That's what they're assuming if we relax things very, very slowly. I mean, there's no option in these models which suggests that there's going to be very few deaths. They're all saying there's going to be tens of thousands. Just a question of whether they're going to be early next year or this summer. It all looks very pessimistic. It should be about data, not dates. Boris Johnson now seems to have made it pretty clear it's about dates, not data. There is no sign of him over-delivering. Over-delivering would mean he brings the end of lockdown closer to us. He's not doing that. He's just under-promising.
Tom, do you think scientists are being somewhat over-pessimistic here, and the most pessimistic scientist is then listened to by the most cautious politician, and you get a kind of doubling down of the pessimism here rather than, a sensible middle course with an eye on caution? Is that what's happening? And Tom, what sort of, signpost should we be looking to if we were to bring these dates forward? Is there some way we can say if R gets to this, or hospitalizations fall that low, or deaths remain below 100 a day, that we that we can bring these dates forward by a month, a week, whatever?
I mean, I think the key thing at the moment is hospitalizations. There's been several very senior people who signaled that hopefully the era of R is coming to the end. I mean, it's a very strange situation where you monitor a disease through cases rather than through hospitalizations, and it was completely the right thing to do. It gets you about 2 weeks ahead of the curve, but this is not something we've done before, and really we want to be doing this on the effect. And so I think they're going to be looking at the NHS, which is still very full. There's still a lot of people in hospital, and we don't want that going up. And so even though we're seeing things getting a lot better, there's this massive lag of the NHS trying to cope with what happened in January and February. My predictions have been very off throughout. We've hit half of Neil Ferguson's sort of much derided predictions for just sort of letting it go through the summer already. We're on about 130,000 deaths. And I'm inclined, my inclination, nevertheless, with the proviso that I've been a bit rubbish at all of this, my inclination is that we're not going to change the 5-week gap between each of these decisions, because that's there for a very good reason. That's there because that's about how long it takes you to see what's actually going on. But there might just be a rabbit out of the hat towards the end of spring where there's actually, look, we've done very well and we're going to bunch together 2 of the things we're going to open in one opening date and end up a bit ahead of things. But I would say that with zero respect for my political analysis and only marginal respect for my scientific analysis.
Okay, well, that's very modest of you. If only all scientists were so modest, Tom. Philip, before I let you go, let me come back to you. Firstly, I can't believe you guys told me not to chase my losses. Southampton have equalised, and you get 10-1 on Southampton. I could have trebled my money in 20 minutes. Oh, God, cowardly. Should have chased my losses. But, Philip, do you think politically there will be an acceleration of lockdown, assuming things, keep on this trend, there isn't some ghastly variant or whatever? But increasingly, if people see deaths fall and hospitalizations fall and the NHS is no longer overwhelmed, it will just feel bizarre that you can't go down to the pub or have people round for dinner once that you've got a death rate that is, minuscule. I mean, horrible for the people and the bereaved families, but not the sort of thing you should lock down for. Do you think that reality will kick in, or is the government going to be absolutely determined June the 21st and not an hour earlier?
Well, I think you're right. I think the public mood is changing. I think it will change further, but I don't sense the government are going to change any of these dates. I'm with Chris. They're just under delivering, and they're under promising. They're not over delivering. But just to pick up on one thing that Tom said, he said there was a 5-week gap for good reason. The reason being apparently that's how long it takes to assess the impact of these changes. Last year, when we were putting in stricter lockdowns, Chris Whitty told MPs at briefings it took 2 or 3 weeks in order to see whether these changes had made any difference. So it's amazing, isn't it? You make these judgments within 2 or 3 weeks when you're strengthening the lockdown measures, but it takes 5 weeks when you're easing them. And I think what we're really seeing is we're seeing a bunch of scientists and people at Public Health England who've always craved to have this level of control over our lives. And they are not going to give it up easily or willingly. And this only comes to an end when the government starts overriding the Sage and Public Health England, or when Parliament starts standing up to the government. It is not going to happen that you're going to get these health experts willingly giving up these controls over people's lives. They've craved this forever, and they're going to milk it for as long as they can milk it for.
So, Philip, just one very final question. We had David Davies on the IA London YouTube channel recently, and I believe he's stolen away from you your title of being the most rebellious Conservative MP. Is it good odds to back you at 6-4 to be the most rebellious Conservative MP over the course of the rest of the Parliament? Should I take 6-4?
I don't know who's laying that. No, probably David Davies is a much better bet, because when he's got the bit between his teeth, there's no stopping him. So I'd say David. He's very welcome to that title. I've held it for quite a few years, I think. So I'm quite happy to hand it on to somebody else.
Okay, well, I might still put an each-way bet on you. I think you've got a fair chance of coming second or third.
Certainly never chase your losses betting on me on anything, Mark, would be my advice.
Philip, lovely to see you as ever. Thanks very much for joining us. Look forward to meeting you in person soon, I hope. Philip, thank you very much indeed. Got 2 more guests joining us. I want to hear their thoughts on dates, data, and the rest of it. and whether we can get out of lockdown a bit more quickly. Konstantin Kisin is commentator, political journalist, co-host of the absolutely brilliant Triggernometry. Konstantin, welcome to you. Good evening. How are you keeping?
Thanks for having me. I'm very well. Good to be with you.
And Whelan is journalist, author of What Women Want. I can't believe I've gone through years without reading that book. I've got to pick up a copy of that immediately. Ella, how are you?
That short as well. It's a pamphlet, so shame on you, Mark.
Easy read. How are you doing, Ella?
Not bad. Thanks for having me.
Good. So, Konstantin, let me start with you. What's your take on this? You know, the rates are declining. You know, we need to be partly cautious. But, should we be easing restrictions more? If we don't, will there be civil disobedience? Fans of Rangers on the streets of Glasgow didn't seem to be observing a great deal of social distancing as they celebrated their first league championship in 10 years. Do you think we'll get more of that? It will actually just become increasingly impossible to police. Might that tip the government into liberalising more quickly?
I don't know. I actually sort of would want a bit of that, if I'm honest with you, but I don't think we're going to see it. I think if the polls are to be believed, people are very, very scared. And actually, as we talk about there being a lag between cases and hospitalizations, I think there's a lag between the country actually not having a lot of hospitalizations and people realizing that actually it's not as dangerous as it used to be due to the vaccination program. So I don't think you're going to see much rebellion, which is, as I say, I think I'm not sure you'd want people on the streets, but I do think I would prefer for us to be opening up faster. Given some of the things that we're seeing. We were told, if you remember, that once all the vulnerable people were protected via the vaccine, that we would start to open up. And I feel the schedule doesn't reflect that.
Ella, are you going to join the chorus here that we can open up faster rather than slower? The government's just, going at a snail's pace, or would it be a mistake to open everything up and have to shut everything down again?
Well, see, if I believe the government statement... Oh, sorry, you were talking to Ella. I thought you were following up
I'll come back to you. Don't worry, you'll get plenty more airtime.
It was International Women's Day, and here I am talking over a woman. That's how you do it.
There you go. Yeah, I knew an error like that was going to crop in. Ella, the floor's yours.
Sorry, Ella.
No, all right. I have to say the time frame doesn't worry me so much because I think, again, I'm not a scientist, and I've flip-flopped on this. Not necessarily flip-flop, but my mind has changed. Back in March, I was scared out of my wits, and then I, became quite a heavy lockdown skeptic, and then being blind, slightly similar to what Chris has been through with the new strain and the experience that we went through of the second wave and all of that. I feel very chastened now in 2021 and much less likely to grandstand on these issues. But I think the difficult thing is what lots of people are finding is that there are elements of the roadmap which just don't make sense. So, for example, the speed in general, I think, might make sense. But the question of opening up to outdoors and the slowness of people being able to meet outdoors doesn't make sense because, even the Gabriel Scallies of this world will admit that if you are going for a walk with someone or 5 people outside, even on a not windy day, then the risk is really, really minimal. And in terms of the value for allowing people to meet up outside socially, economically, I mean, the fact that you can now get a coffee on a bench, but not a pint on a bench, all these things, small as they are, add up to a broader picture of you having to ask the question of, what is the motives behind these decisions? Have they just been plucked out of some minister's backside, or do they actually relate to a serious kind of scientific issue? Is it part of listening to the science to make it so stringent on people meeting outdoors? That doesn't seem convincing to me. But I mean, the spectre in the background is not just the new strains. We've got news of kind of high waves of the virus in Czech Republic, and obviously the whole threat at the moment that the goalposts keep being changed is this issue of the NHS being overwhelmed. And we do have to remember that despite the fact that deaths are going down and that should be celebrated from the rooftops, that there's the kind of clunky nature of the NHS and the failings of the NHS means that we are always skating on thin ice. And while I'm really never a fan usually of the precautionary principle, I think one lesson we can learn out of this pandemic is there is a time and a place for being cautious. Politically, I would say most of the time take the leap. But when it comes to this specific moment that we find ourselves in, which is different from all others, it's different from all other public health issues, it's different from all other pandemics that have come before it. I feel less confident about saying open up, party in the streets, kiss your neighbour.
Cool. Tom, let me come back to you, and we can argue about the schedule and could we hasten it. Do you think Ella's got a point there, that you sort of start with the science and how fast it might spread, but then you make several leaps which aren't necessarily scientific about the precise nature of the restrictions? A coffee on a park bench is fine. 6 people's fine, 8 people is dangerous. Do you think that's where the science gets blurred, that these are much more arbitrary political decisions? The scientists can measure the R rate or whatever else, but the nature of the restrictions are perhaps not the smart ones or the proportionate ones if you want to stop the virus spreading and save lives.
Yeah, so I was going to say I agree with a lot of what Ella said. I'm a huge fan of arbitrary restrictions. I'm not a fan of the particular ones necessarily. I mean, I think if I was in charge, I'd be very, very much more pro being outdoors. Because as Ella says, I mean, the evidence is it's absolutely minimal. All of those pictures of people on Bournemouth Beach with the sort of the resurgence of the telephoto lens as a tool of the tabloid press has been one of the sort of the great things of this pandemic. But the reason I'm in favour of arbitrary restrictions, I got slightly annoyed when people say, "Oh, well, I can meet my friend in this circumstance, but not sit next to them in a pub in a restaurant." Actually, arbitrary is simply you just have to stop mixing in some form, and you choose your way of doing it, and it's always going to be absurd. But yeah, I would very much veer towards outdoors being absolutely fine. I don't actually know of documented examples of infections, certainly large numbers of infections, happening at all outdoors. It seems to be extremely safe.
And Tom, you've written in the Times that the R rate will soon become irrelevant. We'll put up on the YouTube screen a link and a picture of the article. Why is it about to become irrelevant, the R rate? This has been measured to within a decimal point of its life endlessly. Now it's all irrelevant. Is it? Why is it suddenly irrelevant?
It's not quite irrelevant, but so there's several answers. So in the short term, I've been speaking to people in government who are relatively sanguine that they think it's likely that opening schools will tip R above 1. And that's sort of okay for a couple of short-term reasons. First of all, Easter holidays are coming. Secondly, spring's coming, which will chip away a bit at that. And thirdly, if it goes just above 1, we know that there are currently people developing antibodies in large numbers who are also going to be putting pressure to put it below 1. In the more medium term, we're decoupling deaths from cases. If you vaccinate the most at-risk people, then you are changing the infection fatality rate of this disease. And frankly, it's probably at a level now where if this had turned up with this infection fatality rate, we wouldn't have done any of the stuff that we're currently doing. But we are where we are now. The reason why it won't completely disappear is there's this sort of wild card of new variants. You don't want, it's all a numbers game. But you don't want high transmission with a large number of people vaccinated, because that's sort of an open invitation to vaccine escape mutations to pop up. But ultimately, come autumn, if everything goes well, we want R to be completely irrelevant. We want this to be like every other normal disease, where you wait and see what happens to the NHS, and you don't bother sort of micro following a bit of protein replicating around the nation.
Konstantin, let me come back to you. I've got the nightmare on Friday of trying to navigate my way back into the country. I've had a delightful 2.5 months here in Tenerife, beautiful sunshine, restaurants open, can grab a beer, mini bar.
Keep going. You're making yourself more and more popular as you go.
Yeah. I just thought I might as well be honest about it. But getting in's a bit of a headache, but I can understand that. I've had to take a COVID test today. I'm negative. That allows me to get on the plane. That might not be enough, so I've got to isolate for 10 days at home, take 2 more tests. But, Konstantin, since Monday, the government's requiring people who leave the bloody country to have filled out a permit stating their reasons for leaving. Grant Shapps said today that international travel remains illegal. I mean, I can understand why you might not want me back, but I don't understand why you would stop me leaving. I mean, there's something very East Berlin about that, isn't there?
No, there is, and there's another point about the government restrictions that Philip made it earlier before we joined the call, which is that some of the way this has been handled, our freedoms have been seized from us without any parliamentary scrutiny, which should worry people, I think. But the point that I was going to make when I accidentally, but nonetheless rudely talked over Ella, was about the believability of what the government is saying. I mean, one of the things that I would be very happy to accept the current schedule if I thought it was true, but I don't think this idea that, yes, we'll take it extra slow now so that we can guarantee not to roll any of this back. Well, that's nonsense, because the moment the infection spikes for any reason, they'll come back and lock us down again. So I think on a lot of these things, we've got to be very, very careful to consider proportionality. And one of the questions that, you know, as Ella mentioned, and Chris will concede this about himself, we've all changed our minds about certain things over this period of time. One question that has never been answered satisfactorily in my mind is how many people die from lockdowns? That question has never been answered. It's never really been asked particularly. I've never heard Boris Johnson be forced to answer that question. And that is an answer we need to know, because we're trying to solve a mathematical equation without looking at one of the sides. And I think given some of the concerns that people have about the impact of lockdowns, particularly over a 5-year period, that is a conversation we should be having. We've seemed to go full anti-COVID and completely ignored everything else. And I know people otherwise who would have lived a long, healthy life who've sadly died because of lockdown. And I think it's tragic. And we need to know what that is, because this isn't the first time there's going to be a pandemic. And we need to have an inquiry after this is over to understand what the impact has been so that we know what to do next time.
Ella, do you think that's right, that we've been a bit one-eyed about the balance of risk here? Clearly, you know, COVID has been a disaster and, you know, well north of 100,000 people have died, but we haven't considered, Frederick Bastiat would say it's the difference between the seen and the unseen, right? Everybody sort of measures COVID deaths, whereas, you know, the impact on mental health or whatever, people might commit suicide, is less tangible, but could nevertheless be a cause and effect at play there. Do you think that's a problem? We've kind of put all of our eggs, as Konstantin says, in the stop COVID basket, and sort of the perverse consequences of that, the cure might be worse than the disease.
Well, yes. And I mean that it made sense to focus all attention on the immediacy of stopping people from dying from this disease that had come out of nowhere a year ago, and actually even a few months ago, because we were still in the throes of it. But the important thing is that at any point that there was a lull, so either when it was the summer last year or now when we've got the confidence of the vaccine and coming out of this, touch wood, that you would want to see a real an aggressive and positive move to look at and assess, as Konstantin says, the side effects of the lockdown measures, and actually to say that it hasn't been, you know, it hasn't been that people sort of say that, well, this is all just a side effect of the virus, but actually when it comes to the lockdown, there are, as we've just been talking about, certain political decisions that have been made which have had consequences, and you have to know those consequences. I start to get a little bit nervous or queasy when and it's in particular some of the more ardent lockdown skeptics are guilty of this, when there is a kind of playing off of death rates. And the reason, and you know, there's an air of hysteria, I think, sometimes about, for example, what effect this will have on children. You know, when in another situation, I'm arguing with people who would previously have said in politics that children are like rubber balls, they bounce back, that, you know, the kind of influence of the whole discussion on mental health, and everyone having mental health and all these things that I had massive problems with politically before the coronavirus now suddenly are being taken for as gospel, that, you know, it's just simple fact that people are going to become mentally ill if they get locked away. Of course, that is true for some people, but I think, well, a better way of looking at it is what has changed in the last year for the better and for the worse. And the point is, lots of things have changed for the worse. So no, not everyone's gone you know, nuts in their room, and that sounds very callous, but I mean, not everyone has really suffered mentally. Some people have just bored. I'm really bored of myself. I'm really, really bored of myself. I want to get away from myself. But the question is, rather than going to the extreme, looking at the important things of what's happened to sociability, what's happened to people's attitudes to work. I mean, that's one thing I'm really interested in, looking at how many people are going to go back to the crappy jobs they had on the crappy wage when they've spent the last, few months up to a year now on furlough, realizing that actually life is about much more than pushing a mop around a corridor. These are important questions, but asking those is really what you're asking is, how has society changed? And of course, the government never likes asking that. So I think we'll be wishing for a long time.
Tom, just before I let you go, do you think, and all of these will have to come with caveats, and scientists put in even more caveats than politicians, but do you think by June the 21st, this will basically be behind us, cracked, solved? I mean, we might very well have to have an annual vaccine program. I get that, much bigger than the flu program. But is the end in sight here? Or do you think there are elements of how we've dealt with this that will have long run effects? I mean, Ella's mentioned some of the effects around sociability and work, but do you think this might change our approach to medical problems in the future, how we deal with a particularly nasty flu outbreak, for example? Or is this sort of one and done? It's been a grim year. We invented the vaccine. We've rolled it out. Everyone, a good number of people have to have a jab every Christmas or whatever, but we can now put it behind us. Which is it?
I think, with the exception of the sort of the black swan of a really sort of annoying mutation, I think we're certainly well over the worst of it. I don't think things will ever go back to quite what they were. It would be absolutely batty if we hadn't learned some stuff and changed some stuff. Quite clearly, minimal investment in pandemic preparedness is one of those things that, as a cost-benefit analysis, pays off. One of the really interesting stories I covered recently was a team, and there's several teams doing this, trying to make a universal flu vaccine. So a vaccine that attacks a bit of the flu's protein spikes. We're all au fait with protein spikes these days. That doesn't change. And he said to me, look, we're pretty sure we can do it, but we're doing it on the old drugs timetable, where it'll take this many years. And we think probably in 10 years, one of us is going to have this. Now, if you had this thing, everyone could have it, and you wouldn't need annual boosters for flu, and they would actually work rather than varying from 15% success to 60% success. But B, if you just ignore all of that, if there's a chance in the next century of there being a pandemic flu popping up, and there is, then you'd have to say, let's just try to accelerate. We could basically spend whatever we like to get that accelerated from 10 years to 2 years, and it'd be worth it. And I think these sort of low probability, high impact events should probably occupy us just a little bit more, just like a teensy bit more, because it's worth dealing with them.
That's the problem. Politics always deals with the urgent, not the important, right? Tom, lovely to see you. Thanks very much for joining us. Hope to catch up with you soon. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Chris, let me come back to you, Chris, on this point. Do you think we'll be able to, repeal the Coronavirus Act or whatever it was called in its entirety? The whole lot will fully die. Or do you think there's going to be an overhang here for all sorts of reasons, not necessarily to deal with flu, but sort of, that was quite good. We managed to get drinking in pubs down over the course of lockdown. So, why don't we keep a few of the rules there? Maybe you should never be allowed to drink beer on a park bench, just to make sure you don't get drunk. Are we going to get that? Or do you think it will be guillotined come June or pertinent to our previous conversation, potentially earlier if the numbers look good?
There is a danger, as I identified way back at the start of this in a paper for the IEA, I think it was called Liberty After Lockdown, we have essentially created a huge number of massive natural experiments, and it's an ill wind that blows no good. And so although lockdown has been awful for so many things, there's always going to be things it's been quite good for. Obvious example is climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Another example, sort of, I suppose, might be the decline in alcohol consumption or the decline in sexually transmitted diseases. And you can certainly imagine single issue campaigners picking on these in the years to come and saying, look, actually this worked really well. I mean, getting rid of flu has been quite an extraordinary achievement. I mean, literally no flu in most countries this year, starting in the southern hemisphere, coming to the northern hemisphere.
And why is that? Why is that? Why? Because prevented it.
The measures we've used to reduce the R number have been sufficient, although they haven't been sufficient to get rid of COVID all the time, they're sufficient to get rid of flu, because the R for flu is only about 1.2. So it's more or less disappeared. And I don't think in practice the government's going to be making us wear masks every winter for flu, although it's possible people like Chris Whitty will try. But I do think there have been unintended consequences, which some people will view as being positive, which people will try and recapture and recreate in the future.
I want to finish by moving on to International Women's Day, which happened earlier this week. Probably becomes a more and more high-profile feature in the calendar. It was on Monday that the world celebrated, or at least noted, International Women's Day. But I'm not sure the public celebration of the day seemed to be particularly strong. Most of it seemed to come from big businesses burnishing feminist credentials, possibly even virtue signalling. Ella, you tweeted, great tweet, we'll put it up on the screen. You tweeted on Monday, if you stopped a woman in the street in Dublin or London or anywhere today and said, what day is it today? They'd say Monday. They wouldn't say International Women's Day. Do you think International Women's Day matters at all? Is it still relevant? Was it ever relevant? Or does it just actually, is it just a sort of a virtue signal for the elite and most people that you pass on the street couldn't care one way or another?
Well, no, it's an interesting, it is interesting and it isn't interesting, because internationally I know that it means different things, and maybe Konstantin can talk about that. And its history is brilliant. I mean, the reason why the 8th of March in particular is picked out as International Women's Day is because that was the beginning of the women's strike in 1917 against the Tsar. And so actually throughout International Women's Day on Monday, I was pointing out the fact that everyone has their knickers in a twist over an ex-duchess on a day which was originally started to bring down a Tsar is, a little bit disgusting and telling. But I think particularly in the West, I mean, in the UK and the US, International Women's Day is literally pointless. And actually, I'd go further to say that it is the kind of grotesque offspring of what contemporary feminism is, which is really all about kind of middle class, corporate kind of cheerleading of women in a very symbolic, very insubstantial kind of a way. I mean, for example, the UN's always has a theme on International Women's Day, and its theme this year was women in leadership, which, during a pandemic in which some serious questions have been raised about women's freedom, like, for example, child rearing, the level at which women take most of the brunt for child rearing. We've had massive protests in Poland over abortion rights. You had the question of telemedicine in relation to abortion brought up in the UK. So many things, so many substantial things that are happening for women that you could actually tangibly look at. And the UN goes with a kind of celebration of Jacinda Ardern. And no, most women don't give monkeys about that. I mean, by their own admission, it's fascinating looking at polls of how many women identify with feminism. I mean, it was a few years back and before the Me Too movement, but even the Fawcett Society had to admit that it had done a poll saying how many women identify with feminism, and it was like 7%. And they ran this headline saying, "Oh, we're a nation of feminists who don't realize we're feminists." It's like, it tells you everything you need to know. YouGov polls after Me Too put it up to somewhere like, I think, 28%. Just if you say to most women, never mind International Women's Day, what is it that you politically identify? They'd say, what, Brexit or Labour or I'm a Green or something. No one ever says feminist, because it just does not serve women's interests anymore, if it ever did.
Konstantin, you've been studiously making sure that you don't talk across Ella at all, to even keeping your lips sealed.
Make it feel really bad, and
but no, which I know is wholly by accident. I tease. But what's your take on this, Konstantin? I mean, you could say, look, these days, International Women's Day is one of the more high-profile ones, but they're a kind of chance or a trigger to reflect upon things. How far we've moved forward in terms of equality and women's rights and the rest of it, or are they actually a distraction? Do they do more harm than good? Are they mostly harmless, mostly positive, or wholly irrelevant?
It's interesting, because I think if it were not for my background, and Ella alludes to this, I probably would agree with her. But I come from Russia and previous to that, the Soviet Union, where the 8th of March was actually a very important day. And in my culture, Women's Day is a day to celebrate femininity, it's to celebrate women in your life. And in Russia, it's a huge day. People bring flowers to the office. They call all their female relatives. And it really is an opportunity to celebrate everything that's wonderful about women and femininity. And in a society in which increasingly, even acknowledging that there are differences between men and women because is difficult, I actually think it's a healthy thing to celebrate just women in your life. And then conversely, on International Men's Day, whenever that is, we don't know, right, to celebrate the opposite. I just think the whole stupid gender wars thing is just really annoying because it prevents us from recognizing our differences and celebrating them. And, you know, maybe it's a cultural thing, but in my family, it's something that the women really appreciate, and the men take that as an opportunity to be that sort of, you know, knight in shining armor for a day, which they don't normally have.
This is a con. It's basically a second Valentine's Day, it sounds like.
Or second Mother's Day, perhaps.
Or a second Mother's Day. Yeah. It's kind of, blimey. But Chris, what's your take on this? Mainly harmless, should we ignore it, or should, you know, people like the IEA do more around it? And these days and weeks of, you know, usually I think denoted in the diary by the United Nations, are these helpful, you know, notes in our diary for us to reflect upon things, or is it just a sort of woke-a-rama for big businesses to virtue signal?
I think they're mainly just a hook for pressure groups and corporations. I get press releases every time there's an international such and such a day saying, did you know, we sell such and such a thing. Raising awareness, I think, is almost entirely pointless and useless. Anything that's being drawn up as an international day by the UN is almost certainly a waste of time. I think it's National Salt Awareness Week at the moment. There's always something like this. Who cares? It's just for pressure groups to push things. I'm happy with Remembrance Day, happy with Mother's Day, happy with Christmas Day, but any of the new, and I'm happy if it's a proper thing in Russia rather than something that's being whipped up by the UN. Fair enough. You know, if it's traditional, fine, but if it's just some newfangled way to sell you something or push an agenda, I'm not interested.
But what's National Salt Awareness Day? Is this, like Konstantin says, is this when we celebrate the salt in our life, or we
On the contrary,
we have to lament the amount of salt in our life?
We've got to fear the salt.
Celebrate we've got to fear the salt. So some of these days are to fear things, and some of them are to celebrate things. Have I understood it now? I'm not much one for all of these days myself.
National Alcohol Awareness is about. It's not about knowing where you can pick up alcohol. It's to be aware of how terrible it is. Similarly with salt, they're usually set up by pressure groups, and they somehow get into the kind of national diary just because journalists are looking for stories.
Ella, is this a real problem that these are sort of corporate festivals or bureaucratic festivals, not spontaneous events? It's I mean, even if its origins were from that they're now sort of corporate events. I mean, or am I just sounding like, you know, old timers who say, you know, there's not enough religion in Christmas, and, you know, the Easter Bunny over, you know, and Valentine's Day is far too corporate and not romantic? Am I just an old gammon like that? Or is there something that this is just a kind of corporate thing and it's not really a genuine thing, therefore not helpful?
Well, yeah, I guess you have to be honest, and I have to be honest and say that if I had a particular political campaign, of which I've been involved in several, then you want to get people behind it. And so you use, as Chris says, a hook, and, you know, international days are sometimes useful for that. My problem is not the day, my problem is the substance of the day. So it's, you know, I take Konstantin's point about it being a kind of happy clappy celebration of women in Russia, or that sounds a bit mean, but, you know, whatever, second Valentine's
way
Day.
over there somewhere far away.
I mean,
with the savages,
so quaint. Yeah.
That's nice. That's lovely. I mean, when I'm, you know, failed Catholic, we used to bring daffodils to our mum in the church on Mother's Day. Little things like that are nice. I have no problem with tradition, as Chris says. But the problem is, what we're told is that these are politically very significant, and so then we're told that. Or I got a press release from, you know, not obviously everyone's obsessed with the royals there, but I'll bring her up again, from Meghan and Harry's new website Archewell, which had a list for anyone to do on International Women's Day, which included, you know, some things like be nice to military wives, and then also buy from a women-led restaurant, call up your female friend and check in with her, support women-owned business. I mean, and what am I meant to draw from that politically? What is that saying about anything? And I think that's, you know, in the book that you'll read, Mark, What Women Want, the subtitle is Fun, Freedom, and an End to Feminism, because what it was looking at is saying that women's liberation and women's politics that should be about freedom is now actually really about what Konstantin has described as just being nice to women, as if being nice, this whole kind of be kind movement has any kind of political force. If anything that's going to further women's freedom has to challenge the status quo, it has to be dangerous. And there's just nothing dangerous about International Women's Day. And so I say, two fingers.
Ella, you've worried me again that I'm a dinosaur. It has never crossed my mind one way or another whether a restaurant I go to is women-led or not women-led. I mean, it's just literally never crossed my mind.
They usually tell you. That's the key. They usually tell you. It's usually on the front door.
Really? And they tell you on the front door? There's a big sign saying this is a women-led restaurant.
My favourite, I'm in Hackney, which is like, kingdom of the coffee places. But my favourite coffee place is a women-led coffee place. And I do resent going there because they've got a big sign saying women-led, but they do the best coffee in my area. So you're kind of stuck.
Konstantin, am I a dinosaur out of time, or am I right to be worried about this identity politics? I hope nobody's discriminated against, but I just don't care whether my cafeteria is run by a woman or a man, all things equal.
Well, which is why I said I think had it not been for my heritage and other experience, I would have agreed with Ella. I'm no fan of identity politics by any means at all. And frankly, I don't care who runs the restaurant. I care what it produces. Now, in Ella's case, if they make great coffee, the fact that they're women-led or male-led or whatever-led, really not important. And equally, if they were rubbish, wouldn't go there no matter who it was led by. And the quicker we go back to that sort of principle, I think the better we're going to be off as a society.
Chris, I'll give you the final word. Identity politics, is it here to stay? It's not about what you get. It's not about what you get at the restaurant. It's about the gender of the people running it, apparently, is what I'm supposed to bear in mind. I've got to go out and work out where I'm eating tonight. I mean, I was thinking of going to a restaurant where I would consider the food to be the tastiest, but apparently that wouldn't be sufficiently woke of me. Are we in danger of worrying about identities too much, not just quality of service and kind of moving? Martin Luther King talked about a colorblind world, but we seem to be further away from that forever. We look at everything through the, race and gender rather than actually saying that shouldn't be relevant. It should be the quality of people's work and the quality of their character.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of it at all. I'm an individualist. I think we need to push individualism much more in society. Whether it's here to stay, I don't know. It's certainly very fashionable at the moment. I guess the good thing about fashion is things tend to go out of fashion again. So maybe that will happen. I hope so. It doesn't feel to me a sustainable or healthy way for a society to go on.
Chris, one day our views will come back into fashion. I promise you. I promise you. Just maybe a little bit of a wait. Everybody, that's all we've got time for. Konstantin, Ella, thanks for joining us on the show. Chris, thanks for being with me throughout the hour. My thanks too to Philip and Tom for joining us earlier this evening. If you're itching for more IEA content, be sure to hit the subscribe button on YouTube and hit the notification bell. That way you'll get updates on all of our upcoming broadcasts. And as I say, we're getting very, very close now to 10,000 subscribers. In the next few weeks, we've got a number of great events coming up. I'll be in conversation with businessman Jim Mellon at 6 p.m. on March the 23rd. On March the 29th, we are hosting a discussion on the future of UK tobacco harm reduction policy, which will be chaired by the great Chris Snowdon, and alongside many great guests will be the Conservative MP Mark Pawsey. And also a reminder to check out our new series on economic history with Steve Davies. Dr. Steve Davies, our head of education, perfect for students, parents, or even the most engaged policy wonk might learn a thing or two. And my thanks to the Monterey Trust for their assistance in making that course a reality. Tens of thousands of views already, free to watch online. Thanks everybody for watching. Thanks very much to my guests. I'm sorry to report that at half-time, Southampton are 3-1 down to Manchester City. Their odds came into 8-1, but you can now get 250-1 if I'm really going to chase my losses. I've got to go off and watch the second half, which is going to be a grim experience in stark contrast to the previous hour with my wonderful guests. Thanks, everybody. Thanks all for watching. Have a good evening. Over and out.